the early days of travel from Los Angeles to the San Joaquin Valley, there were basically two routes. One was the Tehachapi or Midway route, which followed either Soledad or Mint Canyon, today's Sierra Highway, to Lancaster. Then across the desert to the town of Mojave. Turning west, it went over Tehachapi Pass and down to the San Joaquin Valley and Bakersfield. Unfortunately, any info on these routes is rare at best. Maps or photos almost non-existent. The other was the Tejon Pass route, which took either San Francisco or Bouquet Canyon to the Antelope Valley, where it would turn west over Gorman Pass, then wind down past Old Fort Tejon and descend the tricky Grapevine Canyon to the San Joaquin Valley. Although more difficult, the Tejon route was notably shorter than Tehachapi Pass, but neither could be called direct, for both traveled widely east while the objective was almost due north. Also, you have to remember that these were not roads by any definition we would use today. They were just repurposed stagecoach and freight wagon trails. This, in fact, is one of the main reasons many early automobiles had such high ground clearance. To give you an idea of the difficulty of driving these roads, motorists of the day were advised to carry tools, spare parts, and even emergency rations and at least 2 gallons of water. The Forgotten Highways Tour starts in Saugus and heads north, following the shorter Tejon route. When I planned the Forgotten Highways Tour, I decided to take it because Tehachapi Pass would have been way too long. I wanted the entire tour to be a weekend event, not just the first day. Although it was the less taken of the two, I chose Bouquet Canyon because, aside from it being the much more scenic out of the two roads, it was also a lot easier to climb than San Francisco, the gradients of which approach 10% near the top, a little too steep for the average cyclist. The Big Oaks Lodge, a combination inn and restaurant, was built in the late 1920s. Although it did not exist when Bouquet Canyon was the main route, it had become a local landmark nonetheless. Unfortunately, it burned down in 2018. It was a French sailor turned cattle herder named Francois Cherie who came to the Santa Clarita Valley in 1845 that came up with the name Bouquet when he established the Rancho del Bouquet, spelled B-U-Q-U-E, meaning literally ship ranch. Bouquet is Spanish for ship. It wasn't until years later, when the name was misspelled on a form, that it became confused with flowers. Speaking of wildflowers, it is where Bouquet Canyon ends in the Leona Valley that the real display begins. Here, the tour turns west, following the San Andreas Rift Zone past San Francisco Canyon Road to Elizabeth Lake. A running joke was, if you wanted California beach property at a good price, just buy a lot on the north side of the valley and wait for the big one. After a lunch break in Elizabeth Lake, the tour passes over a gap in the North Ridge, emerging into the Antelope Valley at the current site of the California Poppy Reserve. From this point on to Gorman, the flowers are the star of the show. Gorman marked the end of the first day of the tour. It took 70 miles of riding just to get to this point, and that was on modern roads. Remember, back in the day they would have been nothing more than dirt paths, easily requiring a day or more to traverse. That doesn't include the miles from Los Angeles to Saugus, and you would still need to negotiate the Grapevine grade to get to the San Joaquin Valley. For many years, the San Gabriel and Tehachapi Mountains had formed a barrier that separated southern and northern California. Because of this, the Butterfield Stage Line and later the Southern Pacific Railroad had both wanted to bypass Los Angeles completely, and both companies had to be enticed to route their passes through the city. It was so problematic that there was actually a strong movement at the time to divide California into two separate states. Then, in 1909, the state legislature passed an act that would issue $18 million in bonds for the acquisition and construction of a state highway system. Included in it were funds for the construction of a paved highway from Los Angeles to the San Joaquin Valley. The voters approved the measure, and it became law on December 31, 1910. Commissioner Darlington of Los Angeles would select an alignment for the new highway. This proposed route went straight up to the top of the mountains, where it would follow the ridge line for mile after mile before joining the path taken by the old Tejon route near Gorman. A preliminary study conducted by W. Lewis Clark, division engineer at Los Angeles, dissipated all doubt as to the feasibility of the direct route over the mountains. The new road would wind around the peaks of the mountains, following the terrain in order to save on grading costs during a time when highway expenditures were tightly budgeted. Even at the time, the engineers knew that a better road could be built, but an economical balance had to be struck between the available money and projected traffic volume. Back then, there were less than 126,000 cars in the entire state. Had the route been engineered through the mountain peaks instead of twisting around every pinnacle, it would have depleted money for highway improvements elsewhere. Also, by building along the ridge, they would minimize the drainage problems inherited in mountain highways that were built on lower elevations. The objective back then was just to get out of the mud. Construction on the new road began in 1914 using picks, shovels, and Fresno scrapers, basically graders pulled by mule teams. With limited funds, steam shovels were to be employed only when alternate options were not feasible. Yes, you heard right. It was built almost completely by hand. Over 1 million cubic yards of dirt and rock were removed to create the highway. Climbs were restricted to a maximum of 6% grade, and it had to follow the ridges rather than cut through them in order to save money. As such, the highway ended up with almost 700 curves, enough that if they were added up, they would describe 110 complete circles in the 30-mile length from Castaic to Gorman alone. When it first opened to traffic in 1915, it was only graded and oiled. 2 years later, it was paved with a 20-foot wide, 4-inch thick slab of steel-reinforced concrete. In 1919, when it reopened, it was heralded as a miracle of modern engineering. The new route's twisting ribbon of concrete over this barrier would effectively join southern and northern California, and in doing so, squelch the drive to divide the state. Although the new highway, California Legislative Route 4, was officially named the Tejon-Castaic Ridge Road, it soon became known simply as the Ridge Route. Whereas the wildflowers pretty much dominated yesterday's ride, due mostly to the lack of historic info, today, history is the main player, as much research has been done and published on the old Ridge Route. For the first few miles, the tour followed the same roads as yesterday, as from Cranes, now Quail Lake, northward, the Ridge Route shared the same alignment as the old Tejon Stage Road. We passed the initial site of Holland Summit Cafe and Garage and Caswell's, a restaurant garage inn. Nothing remains today, not even the lots they stood on. Soon after passing Quail Lake, the Ridge Route splits off and begins winding its way up onto the mountain ridges. Soon we reach the commemorative sign, which also marks the beginning of the section registered as a historic monument. After some more climbing, the tour reaches the site of Sandberg Summit Hotel. Originally a simple building built to be ready when the highway first opened in 1915, it soon became one of the most lavish stops on the road. A 3-story log building with a hotel, cabin, garage, a restaurant, and post office. A sign out front proclaiming "No dogs or truckers allowed." A mile later, the tour reaches the actual summit and highest point on the Ridge Route, Libre Summit, at 4,213 feet above sea level. short downhill brought the riders to the remains of the Tumble Inn, one of the better preserved of the Ridge Route's landmarks. It too offered food, auto services, and rooms. The stone retaining wall is all that remains today, although recently someone rebuilt the stone arch over the stairway that once led to the restaurant and cabins. Today, automobile traffic is prohibited from this point on. Not that there was much back when I was running this tour anyway. The next landmark was Kelly's Halfway Inn, also known as Kelly's Halfway House, so named because it was 62 miles from Los Angeles and 64 miles from Bakersfield, or about halfway. It had a restaurant and garage, complete with tow truck, with outdoor toilets available for the public, and 3 cabins. Reservoir Summit at 3,883 feet was not actually the summit, but it did have a high-class restaurant complete with sharply dressed waiters, truckers unwelcome. It also had a garage and gasoline, as well as candies, tobaccos, and pastries, making it an early-day convenience store. Like every other building on the road, it had been bulldozed, the remains pushed off into the canyons by the Forest Service to prevent vagabonds. What hobo would shack up this far from everything, I don't know. Beyond Reservoir Summit, the tour passed through Sweet's Cut. At 110 feet deep, it was the largest excavation on the route. Beyond it, the road wound down Serpentine Drive, often seen on postcards that dramatized the sinuousness of the twisting mountain highway. The National Forest Inn advertised 9 heated cottages, most with running water, ranging from $1 to $2, camping 50 cents, home-cooked meals, lunches, and cold drinks. As with the other establishments, they also had gas and a garage. Cars back then were not as durable as today, and the Ridge Route put a toll on all of them. All that remains today is a few stairs. After crossing Templin Highway, we come across Martin's, a small gas station and garage. What made this site interesting is that the building is still standing. It's now a personal home surrounded by a chain-link fence sporting a sign saying "No photos allowed." As such, there are no current pictures. The original Ridge Route was diverted somewhat with the building of Interstate 5 southbound lanes, but shortly after it resumes its original course and passes by the Ridge Road House, gas, garage, and a restaurant. There were also some nice cabins on the hill across the street. All that is left today is the concrete foundation, and a house occupies the site where the cabins were. The Ridge Road House was the last of the sites I was able to locate at the time, and in the last few years everything south, including the road and even the ridge itself, had been destroyed to make room for a bunch of criminally inflated California McMansions. From Castaic on, however, there are roads that follow, more or less, the original alignment. The tour followed these roads to reach the starting point in Saugus. Day 2's ride was only 35 miles in length, clearly demonstrating the improvement this mountain highway was over the long dirt stage road it replaced. In later years, faster, safer highways in the valley below replaced the Ridge Route, and what was once considered a miracle of modern engineering was left to fend for itself against the ravages of time and the elements. Although the Forgotten Highways Tour took place 6 decades after its abandonment, the Tejon-castaic Ridge Road was still in surprisingly good shape. Not so much today. A century of neglect has taken a serious toll on the old road. Even though it is officially recognized as a historic place, it is not officially being taken care of. Not federally, nor by any state or local government. Its only real caretaker, in fact, is the Ridge Route Preservation Organization, a group of ordinary people who have taken time out of their lives to help save this landmark from its slow disintegration. I would like to thank them, and especially their founder, Harrison Scott, whose extensive research I used in the creation of the Forgotten Highways Tour and the creation of this video.